Broadcasting from the Cass Corridor in Detroit, this is The Metro, a slice of news, culture, and conversation. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Today on the program, Detroit could see the return of a WNBA team.
Say what now? How much have women's sports changed since the Detroit Shock played ball in the Motor City?
And more young people in the city have been getting involved in community organizing. What issues are sending them to the streets?
We'll find out. But first, Detroit has changed a lot over the last 4 decades. The 1990s and 2000s were hard times for many city residents. While Detroit is many different things to many different people, that period became known for the pain people felt. Pain that included bankruptcy, state-controlled emergency management, the decline of the big 3 automakers, vacancy, and crime. Detroit is in a different place now. The city's budget is balanced. More streetlights are working, more blight is gone, and police respond much faster to crises. There are still problems, to be sure. Way more residents are renters, burdened by high energy costs and auto insurance rates. High-paying jobs and great schools are still out of reach for many.
Yeah, Tia, there's a long list that we don't have the time really to talk about, but there's a broader belief that the city is more functional than it was decades ago. Just how big are the differences between Detroit today and the Detroit of the 1980s? And how different does it become depending on the person telling the city's story? John Gallagher has had a front row seat to many of these changes. He's a former 32-year Detroit Free Press reporter and columnist where he covered economic redevelopment. He recently published a memoir titled Belt Reporter about his time reporting in Detroit and around the Midwest. John, welcome to the Metro.
Well, thank you both for having me here.
So you arrived at the Free Press in Detroit in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. Why did you come to Detroit?
Well, I had been, like a lot of younger reporters, I had been at small papers and was looking for a big market and had interviewed in various places. And I really felt good when I interviewed here in Detroit. There was a funny story. They drove me around to show me the city, and the Free Press car ran out of gas, and they had to send a tow truck to tow us back in. And they were sort of appalled and embarrassed, but I thought this is pretty cool. I mean, these guys are, informal, gritty, and I just got a much better feel here than I did anywhere else, and so I was happy to come.
A designated Free Press car. I don't think that the Free Press has one of those today.
They don't have any of those, and of course, my book has two themes. One is the downfall of the newspapers, and the other is the recovery of the city. So 2 themes moving in different directions, but yeah, the devastation that's taken place in the newspaper industry has been really tragic, but balanced by the much happier story of what's happened in Detroit.
Yeah, we'd like to see them converge. We'd like to see the rebirth of both at the same time. Now, there were a lot of problems in the late 80s that the city was experiencing, but Detroit wasn't alone in its problems. High crime rates, vacancy rates going up, more flight to the suburbs. These were problems that other cities were facing at the time, too. So what was unique to you about Detroit versus what you were seeing in other Rust Belt cities?
Well, I think that that other cities looked at Detroit as the worst of the worst. There's a line that I used to hear that, yeah, we have our problems here in Cleveland, Buffalo, Indianapolis, whatever, but at least we're not Detroit. I heard that many times.
Yeah.
And the first 15 years or so I got here, it was pretty relentlessly downhill. All the corporations were leaving town, terrible racial animosity in between city and suburbs. People like Brooks Patterson at Oakland County used to say the most horrible things about the city and laugh about it.
Former Oakland County executive.
And then slowly in the 90s, early 2000s, when it still seemed to be really bad, that's when I started to first get these inklings that things were beginning to happen for the good.
That's interesting because, yes, you had that front row seat. You were so closely following all of the nuances. So you were getting a whiff of change before others were. What was it like to try and capture that and depict that for people?
Well, it was interesting because a lot of what newspapers do is cover the really big stuff, the elections, General Motors, the NFL, the Super Bowl. I mean, the really big events. And a lot of the stuff that was really beginning to turn Detroit around was the really little stuff, the community gardens, the entrepreneurial startups, philanthropic foundations pivoting to be more active in the city. I mean, these things typically did not get a lot of coverage, but somehow I got onto that wavelength, and that's what I was covering. I mean, all the little stuff that added up to some movement. So even before Dan Gilbert came downtown, before the bankruptcy, I thought the recovery dates to at least 2000, when a lot of this smaller stuff was beginning to percolate in the city.
And that smaller stuff that you're talking about, if you are outside of the city, you're that much further removed from it if you're not experiencing it firsthand. And it makes me wonder about suburban residents. There were and still are a lot of suburbanites that view the city with disdain or with fear or a lack of understanding. How did suburban residents view Detroit versus city residents in, say, the 80s and the 90s?
Well, fortunately, it's changing some. We used to have suburbanites say, I haven't been downtown in 25 years and I'll never set foot in that city again. We used to hear that all the time. Now, I can't wait to come downtown and, something like the NFL draft, which was just a little more than a nice big party for a weekend, but still a couple 100,000 people came downtown. Not long ago, I was at an event in Birmingham about the Riverwalk, and I said, how many people in the audience, in this very suburban audience, have been on the Riverwalk? And every hand goes up. So I think the attitudes have changed a lot. You no longer hear, there's no longer this stark divide between city and suburbs. It's much more, I think, cooperative, and people are much more interested in sort of seeing the restaurants and the sporting events and all the rest of it. So I think that attitude has eased quite a bit.
Yeah,
and partly because the really older generation has been passing on, and the younger folks really like cities and really want to be down here a lot. And so I give them a lot of credit. If you go to some of the coffee shops and restaurants in the city, we joke, my wife and I joke, it's a lot like Brooklyn. All the boroughs, all the young people filling up all these places, and that's good.
Yeah, it is. You're talking about some of the socio-cultural shifts and the fact that Detroit has more of these amenities now that draw people from the suburbs. But I want to talk about Detroit's political changes also. You arrived in Detroit during part of Coleman Young's mayoral time and ended with Mayor Duggan. There was, of course, low points in part due to Kwame Kilpatrick's corruption, but generally, this was a hard time for the city. You note that the city had been focusing on quote unquote vanity projects and quote unquote budgetary tricks. What were the priorities of past mayoral administrations in the 90s and 2000s, and why do you think they were focusing on those things?
Well, I think that the notion that you had to do sort of root and branch reform of city government was just too difficult. It was always about, the next budget year, the next election. Let's just get through. Let's sustain the operation, and let's find what revenue we can for the next couple of years, and then push the bills off, push the reckoning off to the future. And I think a whole series of mayors did that because the notion of municipal bankruptcy was almost unheard of. Now, the bankruptcy did do a great deal to reform the city's books. We wiped out $7 billion of debt off the city's books, set up Mike Duggan to be a successful mayor. I think most people count him as a successful mayor. So city government was a mess. It began to spin off a bunch of its operations that it couldn't handle, like Eastern Market, and the convention center went into a regional authority, and street lighting went into an authority, and these turned out to be really successful in getting new management systems for the museums and the Riverwalk and campus marshes and workforce development. All this worked out really well. So we saw a lot of reform of city government, all of it very reluctant. Along the way, none of it was easy, but I think Detroit's done really well with that.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with former Detroit Free Press staffer John Gallagher about his new memoir, Belt Reporter, and how the city of Detroit has changed over the last 3 decades. Now, John, just going back just a little bit, because you talked about the 2000s, and that's like when I started to come to fruition in the city of Detroit. And those were the times when we had block clubs and we started to see the community gardens and we started to see the small businesses grow, especially where I grew up. We started to see some things happening, life happening. If you could just give us a little bit of what that looked like in Detroit when you were starting to notice those little peaks of life popping up in the city again. Not saying that they ever left, but they were always there. So talk about that time.
Sure. Well, it was interesting. I'm one of the kind of people that used to, out-of-towners used to come and say, show me around the city. And it was always, show me the ruins, show me the empty factories, the burned out homes, whatever. And after a while, they started to say, hey, show me these community gardens that I hear about. Show me Earthworks Urban Farm. Show me D-Town Farm on the west side. Show me the DeQuinder Cut. And internationally, that's what Detroit first became known for. That was the first thing that gave Detroit this flavor of reinvention. And when I would visit cities in Europe, they would tell me, Detroit's one of the models of what we're trying to do, because you guys are reinventing all these empty factories and all this vacant land. And so it was really exciting. And as I said, though, it was the small-scale stuff that no one else was sort of paying much attention to. But the block clubs, those kind of people, the community activists, I thought that was really where the reinvention started. And as I said, when you layer on top of that Dan Gilbert coming downtown and the successful bankruptcy, then you really have some legs for this recovery. And that's why I think, when people say, nothing's ever changed, I think it's changed enormously in so many different ways.
And, you were speaking with Robin just a moment ago as well, talking about Mayor Duggan and some of the things that we've seen. We can talk about the Duggan era and the Duggan years, because you talked about post-bankruptcy and some of the things that we've been able to see improve. We've seen the removal of blight. We've seen the speed up of police response times, empower communities to lower violence and crime, and investment in parks and recreation centers. So what do you think are the biggest accomplishments from Duggan? The Duggan era?
Well, he stabilized the city. I mean, on top of the bankruptcy, which gave him financial running room to do that, stabilize the city. He's actually been quite good working with neighborhood groups. And I think always involved, working with city council. That relationship, I think, has been a lot easier than I thought it would have been, given Mike Duggan's personality. He's kind of, a tough as nails kind of personality, but he's actually done pretty well on that way. So I think just stabilizing city government and moving the city forward and getting lots of grant money in for various things, working with, the Obama and Biden administrations, I think all that's been very helpful.
And John, just thinking about it, because you just said it again, you talked a little bit about the Dan Gilbert of it all, and then the money and the influence that he's been able to bring to downtown Detroit. Can you talk a little bit, though, about his controversial, I guess you can say, view from the Detroiters here?
Well, there's long been this question of who gets to be a Detroiter, who gets to help out. I mean, even groups like Kresge Foundation, which are based in Troy, which have pumped in hundreds of millions of dollars into the city, some people still look with suspicion on them and all the other foundations. Mm-hmm. But some of that is easing now, I think, as the recovery has started to take hold, and we're seeing advancement on, education and crime control and transportation, a lot of other ways. Some of that old animosity has begun to ease, I think, not entirely, but somewhat. And so people are more willing to accept that Dan Gilbert has done a lot of good for the city, I think.
And getting into media coverage and getting back to it, because you talk about at the same time that we saw an increase in Detroit's rejuvenation, I guess you can say, you also saw the decline in newspapers, and you saw the decline of local news in general in the city of Detroit. Can you talk a little bit about that and watching the decline of newspapers?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really a tragedy, because newspapers had a breadth of coverage that nothing else matches, even though we do have a lot of new models like Bridge Detroit, the nonprofit news, which does a lot of good, but they don't pretend to be what newspapers used to be. Podcasting has come on, which is helpful, but unfortunately, too many people now get their news from Facebook and Twitter, X, and boy, that's pretty scary, because you're not getting any sort of real objective, detailed news coverage from professional journalists. And so I think what you do here is really important. You're one of the voices of sort of reasoned discussion about the city, and I think we really need that. So I think, yeah, and in addition to thousands of journalists losing their jobs, yeah, I think I think the loss of newspapers is something we've yet to solve.
No, I don't think we've solved it yet, just yet. But like you said, there are some good models out there that are starting to pop up and really tell the story of Detroit in a different light. So you started your journey in Detroit in the 80s. How have you changed alongside with the city? What have you noticed about yourself in comparison to when you started to where you are today? What's the most different about you now in comparison from 4 decades ago?
Well, when I came here, I had never been to Detroit before I accepted the job.
So where are you from?
From New York City originally, and my dad worked for GM, so we transferred around the country, Chicago, upstate New York. So, I mean, I was a big fan of cities generally, and as I said, I was really attracted to Detroit because of the people I met at the Free Press, and they wanted me to cover urban affairs, which is what I wanted to cover anyway. But I think I've just developed a much greater appreciation for what we've been calling the little stuff. So I probably came here and said, what does the mayor think? What does the governor? What does the head of General Motors think? Whatever. And much more began to appreciate the neighborhood activists. And, there's this quote from Mark Twain in my book about how do you become a reporter? You go all over town, you ask all kinds of people, all kinds of questions. And if you do that in Detroit, you get a much better understanding of the complexity of a city and just the appreciation for what so many people are doing.
John Gallagher is a former 32-year Detroit Free Press reporter and columnist where he covered economic redevelopment. He recently published a memoir titled Belt Reporter about his time reporting in Detroit and around the Midwest. John, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Well, Tia, Robin, thank you so much for having me.
Up next, young people in Detroit have been taking to the streets and organizing, especially since President Trump took office. We'll learn more about what's motivating some of them to get involved. This is the Metro on WDET. Stay with us.